Hi, everybody. Happy Pride Month, everyone who's joining us today. Welcome today to our seminar today on dismantling systemic racism. Systemic racism requires white allyship. So thank you so much for joining us for our community forum on effective and authentic allyship. Today's forum is being hosted by the Center for Multicultural and Global Mental Health at William James College with sponsorship from our partners. I am Dr. Natalie Court. I am a professor in the Clinical Psychology Department and the Associate Director for Diversity in our Center for Faculty Development at William James College. I am also a program administrator in our center, as well as the director of our Black Mental Health Graduate Academy, which is a pipeline program designed to recruit and mentor Black leaders in the field of psychology and mental health counseling. So we're obviously living together in an unprecedented time amid the current coronavirus pandemic and the pandemic of institutional racism and systemic discriminatory policies and practices that have for more than 400 years created and sustained significant disparities, which have been burdensome on the lives of many historically marginalized communities. One of the priorities of the Multicultural Center, especially during these times of socio-political unrest, is to ensure that we continue to provide a platform to bring concerned citizens together in order to raise greater awareness about the unmet needs of underserved communities, to strengthen existing networks of allies, and to continue to advocate for resources and services that are needed desperately in order to promote the mental health and well-being of historically marginalized communities, locally, nationally, and across the globe. So to that end, we are so pleased that our dear colleague, Joseph Winn, a clinical social worker, has joined us for today's presentation. Joe is going to be leading today's presentation. So let me tell you a little bit about this amazing person. Joe is a dynamic and interactive conversationalist and orator. And he is going to be leading a discussion today that is quite necessary, one that's been asked for by many during this time. So he's going to be leading a conversation about ways of effectuating powerful systemic social change and ways in which we can build allyship with historically oppressed and intersectionally marginalized groups, especially people of color, who are most impacted by institutional racism and police brutality. Joe has been a conference presenter, a doctoral project discussant, and a guest lecturer at William James College. Our students have learned so much and enjoyed his scholarship. He's going to be reflecting on lessons learned about sustained and authentic allyship in association with both privileged and marginalized aspects of his own identity. Furthermore, he's going to discuss concrete actions that individuals from privileged backgrounds need to take in order to be effective allies and social justice advocates. So Joe will also, after his presentation, be joined by a panel of William James College students who will share their experiences as agents of social change and the barriers that they've encountered, which have directly been related to these efforts. Before we get started, I would like to share with you a statement developed by the Black Mental Health Graduate Academy in response to the issues that we've all been dealing with associated with the socio-political and socio-cultural issues we've been managing. Okay. Hopefully we can all see that. So this is a statement from the Black Mental Health Graduate Academy, which is made up of 32 talented future leaders in the field of psychology and mental health counseling. Our statement states, our country is broken and in crisis, but this is not new. 400 years of white supremacy has meant that this reality has existed for generations. We, the members of the Black Mental Health Graduate Academy, are in pain. We're full of rage. We're tired. We're exhausted by the constant hypervigilance that we experience as we try to keep our Black bodies safe and our resilient souls intact. It's past time for societal change. Given the profound lack of mental health providers of color and the associated epidemic levels of misdiagnosis of people of color, we at the Academy are playing a critical role at the forefront of this needed social change. We ask you to join us. We're specifically and deliberately calling on our white brothers and sisters to stand in solidarity and to assume responsibility for tearing down the veil of white privilege that has for too long and with devastatingly deadly consequences permitted these traumatic realities to be ignored and denied. The casual cruelty on display on May 25th, 2020, as Mr. George Floyd's life and soul drained from his body in broad daylight and in full view of many, is one of innumerable tragic examples of daily and persistent psychological and physical burden of white supremacy. Dismantling white supremacy requires that white allies loudly and unequivocally condemn systemic racism while aggressively rooting out its resulting disparities. The Academy stands with social justice allies from all racial, ethnic, and cultural backgrounds to create fundamental change in our society and in the fields of psychology and mental health counseling, as we also stand with our Black brothers and sisters who are in righteous pain. Thank you. Joe, I'll turn that over to you.
Thank you, Natalie. Hi, everyone. What I'm going to be doing here is sharing my screen and setting up some ground rules before we move on. So one of the things that I want to share is I'm going to speak for about half an hour. And what we're going to do is just lay down a communal contract. So the first thing that I want to say is, to the people of color in the audience, I want to thank you for being here. You've carried a lot of pain and responsibility on your backs for far too long, including being asked to educate us, white people, about white supremacy that benefits us and harms you. Today, please feel free to sit back and be a witness or participant in whatever way that feels best for you. We welcome your thoughts, but you do not have to do anything. Also, if listening to the process of white privilege in and of itself becomes triggering to you, please do what you need to do to take care of yourselves. So the first thing that I want to do in talking about our contract is basically say that this event is to assist white people in beginning to deal with the lifelong and developmental process of becoming engaged in anti-racist practice. We'll be exploring anti-racism and allyship, which requires curiosity, honesty, vulnerability, and self-soothing of intense emotional discomfort. There may be guilt, shame, anger, a desire to change the conversation, to talk about ancestors from indigenous European countries, and white fragility. It's okay, but please keep in mind that those are defenses against exploring racism and anti-racist practice. As we move through this process, please notice your breathing, thoughts, feelings, and reactions. Tune into your body. If you notice intense feelings are coming up, turn to white colleagues, turn to those that you trust. Please do not necessarily turn to people of color unless they have given you permission to do so, but this is primarily our responsibility to carry. Assume goodwill, share the floor, speak from your own experience, and avoid generalizations. There are no monolithic cultures, and we cannot speak about one group of indigenous people of color or Black people, Latinx folks, gay, lesbian, transgender, bisexual folks. Every person is different. Speak from your own experience and avoid generalizations. And please be aware that this group is composed of intersecting identities, experiences, and again, there is no monolithic culture. So I want to talk a little bit about what I'm going to be doing in terms of talking about how systemic racism and racist policy is established and maintained in us white people. And as we go through this process, I will be weaving my own story of realization into this. And I'll be sharing intersectional identities. As Natalie shared, I'm a clinical social worker. I'm also a sex therapist and a certified supervisor of sex therapy. I grew up poor, in poverty, so I'm a class transitioner. I'm cisgendered. I'm gay and queer, kinky, polyamorous. I have severe learning disabilities. So as we talk about the identity formation of how I've come to anti-racist practice, we'll also be talking about intersectionality and how all of those processes have helped me come to a better understanding of how to engage in sustained rather than performative allyship. First thing that becomes important for us as white people to know is that the first indoctrination into racism and racist policy begins at the micro level. And the micro level of experience begins with our families, our friends, neighbors, religion, politics, the absence of folks of color, or if folks of color are in the immediate scene of where we come from, the roles that they play. Are they involved in community service as sanitation workers, or are they doctors and lawyers? Media, jokes, silence, and resources. The meso level is basically where we begin as white folks to become indoctrinated into racist beliefs that take the form of community, our neighborhoods, the resources those neighborhoods have, miseducation, and that's basically the whitewashing of history along the lines of a primarily white, heteronormative experience in which the worldviews and cultures of people who were here in North America prior to the arrival of Europeans are stripped from history, and how we rob our brothers and sisters who are folks of color of their rightful voice in being heard throughout the ages. It also includes the businesses that we take part in. So if you live in an area where businesses are personally owned, you also have to take a look at what those businesses are. Are they check cashing places, or are they places where folks own their own business and are doing business within the community openly and proudly? We have to take a look at police presence. The poorer the neighborhood, the darker the neighborhood, the more people of color, the more police presence. The absence of police presence speaks to communities of affluence and wealth and a great deal of privilege. We have to take a look at healthcare, courts, what holidays are celebrated, as well as state and local government. At the macro level, racist policy is learned and indoctrinated and reinforces what white folks have come to believe about themselves. And again, this includes erased history, the naming of buildings, national mythologies, and in the United States, that national mythology is when you come here, all your history is wiped out. White people become invisible to their own ethnicities and the struggles of the ethnicities that brought them here. So when you come here and you ask folks, white folks, about what ethnicity are you, more often than not, what you hear is, I'm white. So it's important to recognize that once you're robbed of an ethnic identity, one of the things that happens is you're robbed of history. and you can start to be manipulated into believing bootstrap theory, so on and so forth. You have to take a look at the policies, agendas, economics, media, international policy, and the ways in which war is used to continue to reinforce ideas of white supremacy, nationalism, and the idea that white and might makes right. As white folks, we must interrogate and challenge the damage of race as an aspect of anti-racist practice. It becomes important to recognize that while race is a construct, we've become enslaved to the construct of race, so that cultures and civilizations and identities are projected onto one another, making people invisible and allowing us to move into, particularly white people, a sense of knowing things that we in fact don't know, which comes from a place of privilege and entitlement. It's also important to recognize that all forms of oppression are indeed interconnected and reinforcing. However, today we're going to be focusing primarily on whiteness and anti-racism. So why is this important, and why is a middle-aged white man talking to you about the development of racist practice and policy in the United States? Growing up in poverty, one of the things that I came to believe was that the issue of race was overblown, and that it was an issue of class. Growing up in poverty, growing up on food stamps, and in a violent environment, I came to believe that the real issue was class, and no one wanted to talk about that. As I got older and quit school, one of the things that I started to also deal with is, why are so many folks of color getting scholarships? So there was a deep awareness in me of resentment towards other folks getting what I thought I should have had. Right there in hindsight, I started to recognize that that was the operationalization of the privilege that had been injected into me. As I started to become more aware of my own queerness and my own identity, particularly during the time of the beginning of the AIDS epidemic, I started to recognize that issues of oppression based on race and class and sexual orientation were really important to begin looking at and deconstructing power systems within the United States. It wasn't until I began to provide healthcare services to folks who were dying from AIDS, and I began to work with folks of color, that I began to see the disparities. One of the things that became really important to me in the process of challenging my own whiteness and moving towards anti-racist practice was the discovery of Kimberly Crenshaw's model of intersecting identities, or intersectionality. So one of the things that I would like folks to do, and I'll be talking a little bit more about my own journey in a minute, is to take a look at this slide and to begin identifying places on the dominance margin, which is above, and the dominated group, which is below. What I would like you to do is take a look along this continuum of all of the different places where you may find parts of your identity. So for me, I can find myself listed as a cis male in the dominant area. I can see myself as male and white. So even though I grew up poor, the color of my skin provided me with opportunities to move forward that my brothers and sisters of color did not have access to. Excuse me. So that became important to take a look at. As I began to look at places where my body was able to work, I realized that ableism was also a part of this. As I began to become more educated, I realized that I had credentialist abilities, that I had degrees that allowed me to pursue possibilities that might not be available to others. As I began to transition from poverty into working class, into middle class, I began to realize that moving from one place to the other still allowed me to carry a lot of privilege that I had previously had. Clearly, I'm a lighter skinned white male. I was raised in a Christian environment. Some of the places where my identities were oppressed included being gay, coming from a working class and poor environment, carrying that sense that the way you move through the world is working, which ties into bootstrap theory. I was initially non-literate. I couldn't read until I was 8, quit school, got a GED, began to load trucks, then went to community college, and then eventually decided that education was the way I wanted to go. I was queer, and that I was gay, and moved in several other sexual minority communities. So I began to look at the ways in which all of these intersecting identities began to impact the privilege that I carried in the world. And what I realized was that if I was going to be advocating and teaching around issues of, because I do a lot of training around diversity on LGBT issues, it was imperative that I become more literate on issues of race. So I began to seek out trainings. I began to work on becoming more literate in issues of intersecting poverties, became a big fan of Angela Davis, began to really listen to the works of Tim Wise, began to read a lot of materials, and then eventually ended up doing training with the People's Institute for Survival and Beyond in New York in a program called Undoing Racism, which really helped to bring to the forefront how all of these aspects of identity that I had been separating were actually working together to keep me at war with myself. And the more preoccupied I was with being resentful about the class I was raised in and carrying hostility towards people of color and beginning to recognize the reality of the issues that folks of color had to deal with, the more I began to recognize that the only way to begin challenging racist policies and moving towards anti-racist practice was to recognize that all of us carry these identities. As I moved through this process, I began to carry a profound sense of guilt and shame. And over time, I was assisted to recognize that these weren't helpful, that those pains and those tears were actually tools of racist practice to keep me silent, to prevent me from moving forward. Because one of the things that we as white folks learn is that we are entitled to feel comfortable, oftentimes at the invisible expense of those folks who don't have our privileges. This is also when I started to take a look at the role of capitalism and free market enterprise and this idea that everyone could get wealthy in the market. Well, no, that's not true. So what also became important is to begin acknowledging that if I wanted things to be better for LGBTQ plus people, I also needed to work for the rights of people of color, indigenous folks of color, Black people, Afro, Latino, African American, whatever names were used to begin describing the experiences of folks of color. It became imperative for me to learn about those cultures and the pain that those cultures had been exposed to based on American imperialism. And it's also important to recognize that what we're talking today about is challenging North American racism. Every culture, European culture and other cultures carry racism. The uniqueness of American racism is steeped in capitalism. And unless we take a look at how we move in those systems, our attempt to become effective allies is going to be greatly hindered. So allyship is not a noun. It isn't a label or something to claim. Instead, you are an ally when you take action, make a stand, or do something to make a difference by standing up against oppression and marginalization. You become an ally when someone else recognizes you as an ally. That's from the Blackburn Center, and they focus primarily on domestic violence and social justice. This is from the Dismantling Collective. A white ally acknowledges the limits of his, her, their knowledge about other people's experiences, but doesn't use that as a reason not to think and or act. A white ally does not remain silent, but confronts racism as it comes up daily, but also seeks to deconstruct it institutionally and live in a way that challenges a systemic oppression at the risk of experiencing some of that oppression. Being a white ally entails building relationships with both people of color and also, and this is primarily important, because white people do not like talking about race, also building those same connections with white people in order to challenge them and their thinking about race. White allies don't have it all figured out, but are deeply committed to non-complacency. What's important in these definitions of allyship is that it calls us as white folks to begin looking at not only our privilege, but in the ways in which entire systems and structures and policies are geared to help us move forward, often at the expense of others, marginalized communities. So if you think about the intersectionality wheel and the places where you are a member of a marginalized community, and you are also a member of the dominant cultural group, it's important to recognize that racism and all of its interconnecting injustices and biased beliefs are constructed to keep you ignoring those parts of where you are not empowered and overly focusing on the places where you are empowered while keeping you invisible to the privileges of those battling senses of self. So basically, what we're going to talk about in terms of how to be an ally, all right? And I've geared this specifically towards clinicians as well, because oftentimes as clinicians, we fall under the belief that what happens clinically is not related to what happens politically. And as a social worker, and I know that many of the students at William James and the other teaching that I do at South Shore Sexual Health Center, where I train folks to be sex therapists, one of the things that often comes up is I hear folks shy away from bring up issues of race and class and gender and sexuality and identity, because they were taught that the clinical is something that happens between the ears rather than between people in culture. So the first thing that I want to say is the clinical is always political. And this is going to be the backbone of how we begin thinking about allyship. So what becomes important if we're going to be white allies is to recognize that while we didn't create these systems of slavery, we are not responsible for the history that existed and came before us. We are responsible for taking a look at how we benefit from those systems and the process of beginning to dismantle them to create a society of equanimity. That means taking on the struggle as a personal issue. An injustice against one is an injustice against all. Know the racist history of the fields that we work in: social work, psychology, nursing, marriage and family therapy, mental health counseling, all have deep roots in maintaining whiteness through the use of research and clinical theories and practices, or by the erasure of entire cultures to maintain whiteness at the forefront of our field. Unless we can begin understanding that reality, we can't begin to change it. So this is where Fritz Fanon's work comes in. The Wretched of the Earth is a great place to start by taking a look at the role of colonialization on mental health towards non-white folks, as well as, and we'll talk about this later, how racism impacts white people in ways we're taught to be invisible to. Work to transfer benefits of your privilege to those who lack it. What that means is, in clinical practice, I provide a lot of free supervision to folks who are looking to move up the ranks. And this isn't to the virtue signal. This is to say it's a way to give back. That's all pro bono. Acknowledge that while you may feel discomfort, pain, anger, sadness, the conversation is not about you. It's not about, I feel badly about this, I feel badly about, being white. No one's asking you to apologize for being white. No one wants to hear about your white guilt and shame. What folks want to know is, what are you going to do to help us move forward? Listen, don't assume that you can speak to the struggles and lived experiences of others. They are not a monolithic community. This is also important because as white people, we often come to believe that we can speak on anything we want because we're white. Donate time, talent, resources, presence, and finances to anti-racist practice and causes. persist when the headlines fade. Not everyone can march in the streets. Not everyone wants to march in the street. But if you can write a check, if you can show up at Surge or other white affinity groups to begin donating time and your body on the front lines, or your money or resources, that's a movement towards allyship. Be prepared to make mistakes. When you do, own them. Decenter yourself and recognize that this is the work of a lifetime. You're going to make mistakes. You're going to say things that people are going to point out and say that's racist, that's classist, whatever. It's important to recognize that most of the time when you're being educated in that way, what people are talking about is not your intent, but the impact of what you said. Also, be prepared to recognize that some folks are going to be really leery about why you, as a white person, is showing up to help. This is predicated in hundreds of years of white folks betraying folks who, people of color who thought that they were in fact allies. Don't take it personally. You have to earn those chops. Educate yourself. This is central. Don't ask folks of color what you can do, what you should read. You can go on Google. You can go on Amazon. You can go to bookstores owned by people of color. You can read Robin DiAngelo. We've given you a biography and some podcasts. Educate yourself, all right? Attend trainings and workshops on anti-racist practice, and work with other folks to keep yourself connected to those trainings and those commitments to change. Locate white affinity groups that can support you in your struggles, frustration, learning, and healing. It's hard for white folks to talk about race. It's hard for us to look at the ways in which we've contributed to the oppression and degradation of other people and people of color. The idea here is that you were born into a system that taught you this. You learned this. It's like a fish in water, right? To use that old metaphor. What's important is that you begin to move in recognizing that you were trying to make the world a better place. Also, a close friend of mine, several close friends of mine who are clinicians in other parts of the country also wanted me to add that allyship is something that you cannot do all the time. You need breaks. You need to step back, recharge, and contribute, which is why if you can't be on the front lines, get involved in other ways, all right? The idea is that trying to constantly be in a state of allyship will burn you out. And because white folks have the luxury of disappearing back into the background, becoming invisible, maintaining allyship that allows you to sustain yourself and the support of others is imperative. So I did this in 25 minutes. I feel really good about that. I'm now going to withdraw and turn it back over to the rest of my colleagues and panelists. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. That was really, really informative. Thank you for such a critically needed conversation, critically needed information and guidance. So I just have a couple of things before we move on to our student panel. I'd like to just remind everybody that everybody's going to be muted and stay muted so that we can minimize any interference and background noises. There's going to be a question and answer opportunity at the end of today's presentation and discussion, but we would like for you to use the chat box to post any questions or comments that you might have. In addition to that, we have sent you all our PowerPoint documents. Much of the resources that Joe has mentioned is provided in the documents that we're sending to you. And to contact CMGMH, the Center for Multicultural and Global Mental Health, you can email us at cmgmh@williamjames.edu. I will now introduce our amazing student panelists. Please review their entire bios, which we've provided. I'd like to introduce Emily Crane, who is a rising third-year doctoral student in clinical psychology. She's also studying in our concentration on Latino mental health. We also are joined by Juan Rosario Jr., who's a rising fourth-year doctoral student in clinical psychology. He is in the concentrations on Latino mental health, neuropsychology, and geropsychology. Tanya Jimenez is a fifth-year student in our clinical psychology program, and in fact is a candidate now for her doctorate degree. She's in the Latino mental health program, and in 2007 she obtained a Master's of Arts and Master of Education degree in psychological counseling from Columbia University. We're also delighted that we're joined by Aliana Wilkie, who is a recent, brand new graduate, and congratulations again, Aliana, graduate of William James College's Bachelor of Science in Psychology and Human Services program. She currently works with latency-aged youth at the Justice Resource Institute, as a therapeutic counselor. And finally, Ellen Yang is a rising third-year doctoral student in our clinical psychology program. She has been incredibly instrumental in supporting the development of William James College's brand new Asian mental health program, and we thank you for that, Ellen. Next year, she's going to be one of Clark University's Center for Counseling and Personal Growth's first interns for their new multicultural track. So thank you all for joining us today. And I have a couple of questions that I'd like to ask you as our panelist. And Joe, we welcome any thoughts related to the questions and topics that we have. Okay, so Juan and Tanya, I'd like to start with both of you, if you don't mind. You've both shared some challenges in Latinx families and communities that are related to issues of colorism that have been coming up more recently as we're all dealing with this social unrest associated with issues of race and ethnicity. You shared that there's been some challenges and difficulties as families have tried to discuss and understand some of the complexities and intersectionality that many of us experience. So I'd love if you can share with us some of the issues that are creating conflict in Latinx communities as we manage this socio-political crisis. Juan, you're muted. Okay. All right. We're having trouble unmuting you.
Can you hear
me? Okay. Juan, unfortunately, we are not hearing you yet.
Hello, can you hear me?
We can hear you, Tanya.
Okay. So, is it okay for me to start?
Sure.
So first, I just want to start by providing a definition so that we can all be on the same page. This definition is from Margaret Hunter, 2007 article titled "The Persistent Problem of Colorism, Skin Tone, Status, and Inequity." She defines colorism as a process of discrimination that privileges light-skinned people of color over their dark-skinned counterparts. Colorism is concerned with actual skin tone, not racial or ethnic identity. Lighter-skinned people of color enjoy substantial privileges that are still unattainable to their darker-skinned brothers and sisters. And then there's examples. Light-skinned people earn more money, complete higher years of schooling, live in better neighborhoods, and marry higher status people than dark-skinned people of the same race or ethnicity. And colorism is a manifestation of racism. I wanted to just give that context. And I also really appreciate, Dr. Court, your emphasis on authenticity. And that's why I would like to share how I was a perpetrator of colorism, because I think that can be helpful to some folks in the audience. And so when I was 20 years old, I'm 36 now. When I was 20, my twin sister was pregnant, and her child's father is Black. And I remember going to the hospital, in the hospital room, waiting for my niece to arrive. And I said, to my sister and her partner at the time, I hope she looks like us. And I said something to that effect. And then after, I forgot how the conversation ended or changed, but after the fact, my sister called me and said, her partner was offended by what I said and that he was crying. He was extremely hurt by my statement. And I felt hurt that I hurt my niece's father. I was in distress. I reflected where that statement came from, and it was obvious that we all understood that I was trying to imply, I hope my sister looks like us, meaning the skin color. I hope she comes out light. And I said that because I was hoping that she can gain the privileges that I have experienced, preferences, dating, because we know that in Latino and Black families, you start to get, guys will prefer you. And so I had to reflect on that. And so what I did was I approached my sister's partner at the time, and I apologized and I cried with him. Because for me, crying helped, because I was in so much pain that this came out of my mouth, that I actually was thinking this. And I think this is important because a lot of people don't know how to manage their feelings, and they'll try to suppress it. And for me, as a Latina, I've seen this, and it comes off from white people as invalidating. And so for me, I wanted to sit there and cry and talk about, like, I hurt you and I don't want this to happen again. What can I do? How can I repair what I've done, and also continue to work on this issue of colorism, because I did not want my niece to be affected by this. I did not want her to feel inferior because she was Black in our family. And so then after I graduated undergrad, I went straight into graduate school and obtained my master's degree. And that program really focused on social justice and racial identity. And that is where I was able to unpack my skin privilege and my colorism. And again, when I entered school in 2005, I had a Black Latina student. She was a doctoral student from Panama, and who challenged me, who said to me, I read your papers. You're sitting here in group process. We're talking about privilege, and you have not acknowledged your skin privilege, not one bit. And she actually told me that after the group process class, and I really appreciated that. And so that was another way for me to unpack that. And I think I wanted to share that part because it helped. I never once became defensive. Like, I really appreciated their feedback, and they also did it individually, so that helped. I think to do it individually helped, and it was another person of color doing it. So that helped my process. I don't know if you want to share on another note, Juan.
Can you guys hear me now? Is it okay? Thank you, Tanya, for sharing. So for myself, I can speak to my own family, friends, and just acquaintances. And for my community, I think there's been a lot of confusion lately. There's been a lot of confusion as it pertains to the Black Lives Matter movement. And so I've myself have had to educate myself. I've grappled with these things and explaining it to my own family. And there's just been questions as it pertains to, like, the protesters, the rioters, who's Antifa, all of these agendas, and just the the history of oppression in our country when it comes to blacks. And so my experience and my family is a little bit different. We migrated from Puerto Rico to the US for a better life. So as a Caribbean islander, my experience is a little bit different. But that doesn't exclude the fact that there's colorism in Puerto Rico, there's colorism in the Latino community. It's very pervasive. And even within my own family, so those in office, we can't take away from the fact that it's also those voting. It's also SES bound, right? So I have a very diverse family, and so we have these conversations. And lately, I've had to take a step back and just kind of engage in my own self-care, away from these conversations, because they're draining, and I think that they're very toxic to my own spirit and my own beliefs. And so at the end of the day, it's unfortunate. People are gonna believe what they believe, but it doesn't mean that we don't stop fighting for the cause and educating folks. And I think a lot of this Joe has echoed. He's great. And in my own family, I mean, for myself, I can say I have, passing privilege. I'm a light-skinned Latino, but my younger brother doesn't, he doesn't have that. He's very dark-skinned, looks Afro-Latino. When people approach him, they actually assume that he's black, opposed to Puerto Rican or Latino. So for myself, I mean, by proxy, I'm, extremely stressed out even during this time, because I fear for his body, I fear for his mind, his spirit, and this has been pervasive, ever since, Chicago's not the safest city for those of color. I don't think anywhere is, but it's been very pervasive. And so this time has, I'm constantly reaching out to him, Josh, can you just stay home? Can you guys just order in food? Can you just not be in public alone? And so I don't know if this is the reality of parents on here, but my reality is I basically have to track my brother, on my phone, because I don't trust the world with him. And so, this is very unfortunate, but this is the reality that Black folks and those of color live. And those that are even light-skinned, we suffer by proxy, stress, anxiety, depression, all of that stuff, all of those symptoms. And so there's also been conversations in, my family, again, because we migrated. Is this Black Lives Matter movement, is this fight our fight? How do I educate myself? Do I need to be educated? Do I do anything? Do I just stand there? And a lot of it has been, saying just because we're Caribbean Islanders, we have colorism in our society, and we have to speak up about it, regardless where you're at. And so the conversations that have been had, they've gone relatively well, and I think it's negating, racist behaviors and negating being complicit to racism. And that's something that it's a lifestyle. It's something that you just do. I don't get to hide from, my skin tone. My brother can't hide from his skin tone. This is something that we carry on, throughout the day. So advocating for those, is something that we have to do ongoing. And I think and even just, I'll say one last thing, as someone that provides psychotherapy and does neuropsych testing, a lot of my experience and training thus far has actually been with white people, not with Latinos. We have to also remember that folks of color, many times don't have access to healthcare, to medical services, to all of these, concierge services, if you look at it that way. And, working with the few folks of color that I've had the privilege to, whether adolescents or adults, I really own up to the fact that, I'm in the room with someone that's darker than me. And whether I like it or not, I represent, the colonizer. I represent a history of pain and a history of oppression. And that's something that I've had to, do my work on consistently. And sure, sometimes it's a little bit uncomfortable, other times it's fluid, but you really own up to it for the sake of your patient's healing and for the sake of, encouraging them and empowering them. And I think that when we have these conversations, not just rapport, is being had, but trust. And that's something that in itself is very healing. And I think I'll stop there. But thank you again, Dr. Court, for the question, and thank you for this panel and everyone on it.
Thank you, Juan and Tanya. You have demonstrated what we all need, incredible empathy and courage. So, and please, Joe, if you have any thoughts or any other panelists who would like to jump in, please do so. I do have a question for Ellen, unless anybody else wants to share. Okay. All right. So, Ellen, I'd like to turn to you now, and hopefully you've been able to unmute. So I'd like to turn to you. You've mentioned in recent conversations that we've been having that in the Asian community right now, there are new and challenging conversations about issues of allyship with Black and Brown people, most impacted by police violence. You've also talked about the issues associated with the model minority myth and the way in which that politically driven idea of Asian Americans as the best, better minority group in comparison to others has really been taking hold in the Asian community, conversations about this. So I'd love if you would share with us some of those discussions and your thoughts about those discussions.
Okay, I got it. Sorry. So yes, like this time has been so much a time of self-reflection in our community. I'm learning so much, but like when the coronavirus, COVID-19 kind of came out into the world, we were kind of shook by how much racially motivated attacks and violence there were against the Asian community. And upon reflection, it's like we thought we had gotten to a level of almost whiteness, and like to be attacked and seen as the foreigner and that like model minority myth that we had been sold on was not true, was really hard for a lot of people. And my parents had immigrated here with $100, and like there's this idea of the American dream, right? Like you can come here, you can have a better life. And the model minority myth became such a foundational part of my upbringing, like work hard, get that education, and then you can reach that dream. But that myth, which was coined by a white man to invalidate the civil rights movement, it really is just trying to create this racial hierarchy. And we've been complicit in that, and realizing that we have been complicit in white supremacy is really difficult sometimes when you've been hurt or you're just struggling with that as well. But we have to recognize that we need to connect with other communities of color and fight against the people that are struggling to drive wedges between us, because we can't fight anti-Asian racism until we deal with anti-Black racism and fight against white supremacy in general. And that includes bringing this matter to our families. Sometimes we think we are not part of this conversation because we are not white or Black. And that's really not the case. Anti-Blackness is entrenched in our culture based on colonialism and white supremacy. Colorism is so a part of Asian culture. All of our skincare is whitening mask, or if I get tan, my aunts freak out. It's when you become darker, you become dirtier and like a farmhand and all of these things that come along with that. And when I was a teenager and I asked my mom, like, do you prefer that I date another Chinese man? And she said, no, as long as you're happy, but it would be a lot easier if you didn't date a Black man. because like people in China don't really get it, and like it would cause a lot of uproar in our family trying to manage it. And that was the first time that was like, oh, like we specifically identified like this would be a trouble. And that kind of made me reflect and think about it as well as like, where did this come from? Like, why is this here? And now dating a Black man and being committed and going through our lives together and our family kind of learning and growing, is like, sometimes we don't want to bring up that conversation with our elders. Sometimes we give up hope that we can have those conversations and have those changes. But it's so essential and it's so necessary. And there are resources out there to help starting these conversations with your family, because none of it is fair and none of it is okay. And so there's justice for everybody.
Thank you so much, Ellen. I think you've left us with a lot to think about. You're bringing to our attention areas of concern and issues that have been there for a while, but just hadn't been discussed openly, explored openly. So we really do appreciate that. I'd like to now turn to Aliana and Emily. We'd love to hear your thoughts about some of the challenging issues of intersectionality associated with gender identity and sexual orientation. As many of you know, Black transgender women are frequent targets of social harassment, discrimination, and violence, and sometimes at the hands of police. So we would love to really engage in a conversation about intersectional marginalization. So please, any thoughts you have, Aliana?
Yeah, I definitely do not mind starting. So I'm going to do a little shout out to my advisor from the bachelor's program, Professor Salvador, because I wanted to start off talking about resiliency. That is really been, the volume has been turned down in terms of our conversations about resiliency of people of color and of LGBTQIA plus individuals. And I think that comes as a disservice to everyone involved when we don't talk about those things, and we don't talk about, you know, for instance, the fact that I, as a queer questioning individual, when I made the decision to shave my head and become a little less passable, I really did a lot of thinking about how Black and brown people, particularly queer individuals, have paved the way, and I wasn't even familiar with those people. So, like, for instance, having never even heard of Angela Davis until recently, and saying, as a Black lesbian woman who is also a Black Panther and a communist, how much has her voice really been downplayed? How often does that happen? And how often are people left out of the conversation? And it's I've been doing reflecting on the term inviting people to the table, and I've heard this used in activist circles. It implies ownership of the table, and we need to have people be able to set those tables. So even in rallies that I've gone to, it is pretty apparent, even in the chanting, that there are a lot of Black women left out, Black trans individuals left out, and probably not in a purposeful way, but that's just the point. They're just left out. And yeah, those compounding marginalized identities, they're so important now more than ever. And as someone who is able to use my privilege in ways that I feel are most powerful, like this is my lane, I have found. And so I want to take what I've learned about both of those struggles, because they're not separate, they're very much interconnected, and we're just not talked. That's just not talked about. And where I live, Cape Cod, Massachusetts, population is about 92% white, while we have Provincetown, which is a really like gay queer hub. And so those are both fronts that I feel really need to be addressed by people like me who are able to potentially shift between those identities, and that's privilege in itself. So yeah, I want to be able to, bear witness to those people moving forward.
Thank you so much, Eliana. Much appreciated. Emily, your thoughts?
Yeah, thank you for inviting me to speak. I want to talk a little bit today about intersectionality of identities and visible versus invisible identities. So one of the things that I've thought a lot about, and admittedly this was not something I was thinking about, as Tanya said, in my early 20s, this is something that has taken me time to get to, is the fact that as a gay woman, a cisgender femme gay woman, I can walk around in the world and people generally assume that I'm straight, based on the way I present myself and the way that I dress. And I have the privilege of outing myself or keeping it a secret or keeping it to myself. And that is a privilege in itself, to decide when I want to disclose identities. Something that communities of color face is they don't have that luxury of deciding, does it feel safe in this space to reveal who I am? They cannot become unblack, unbrown. And so that's something I'm thinking, a lot about too in the queer community, is that, and not everybody is passing, but there's a good chunk of us who are. And so I'm thinking about that. When my partner and I go different places or travel around the country together, we make a conscious decision not to hold hands in certain places to avoid a violence. Black people can't avoid violence. They walk down the streets and people see who they are and make assumptions, and their bodies are not safe. And so that's a privilege that I have as a queer woman. The other thing I think that is important to think about too here is for the queer community to sort of talk about like what our roots are, how the gay rights movement came to be. It was Black trans women who really spearheaded the gay rights movement. Marsha P. Johnson and Miss Major Griffin Gracie, those were the two women who really led this movement for us. And I don't think people know their names. I don't think we give them credit. And unfortunately, since then, white queer individuals have sort of taken the narrative and run with it, which is great, but we're leaving out the queer and Black voices in our community. And their bodies are not safe. And so if one of us isn't safe, we must do something about it. And the other thing that I would like to mention as well is that there's this idea, I think, in the queer community that, well, I'm gay, so I'm marginalized, so I can't be racist because I experience oppression. There's no way that I'm oppressing other people. And I think that's a myth that we want to start to detangle and talk about, because we absolutely can be racist, and we are. We're inherently racist based on, like we've been talking about today. It's like water, right? We're the fish. Racism is water. We're swimming through it. It's there all the time. So I really want to make a call to the queer community that we do our homework and that we really look at how are we contributing to dismantling systems of racism in the larger world, but also within the LGBTQ community, because we're not doing it good enough and we must do better.
Could I jump in on what Emily said? And I'm really glad you brought this up, Emily. And good job at outing yourself too, by the way. I'm applauding you. One queer to another. I'm like, my hands are right. As a white gay man who's queer, who's also poly, I've been married 30 years. I helped to raise 3 biracial kids who their father was Puerto Rican, and to protect them from racism, and they look as Celt as I do. He erased his last name from their birth record and put Winn, so that when people see them, they appear as Celtic as I do. My oldest is married to a Brazilian man who's deported. Both her children are fluent in Brazilian Portuguese. Now she is relocating from Minas Gerais at the height of the COVID virus. So it's important that white folks recognize that when they see other white folks, never to assume that racism doesn't impact us and our families. And that just gets erased. I think the other thing that you said that I wanted to celebrate is my partner of 3 years is Mexican American. So we talk of this is always on the table. It's like, what do you want for dinner? How about chicken? And oh yeah, let's talk about racism. How about pork chops? And oh yeah, are we talking about how the queer community is erasing black and brown folks? It's like, oh yeah, can we talk about how white, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, questioning, intersex, asexual, ally, plus people are engaging black and brown and indigenous skinned people for fetishization. You know, I'll have sex with you, but don't expect I'm bringing you home. All right. Can we talk about black and people of color and indigenous trans women who are getting murdered without whitewashing the fact that most of them have to engage in sex work because they're not being hired in positions that they're trained to do. So I think, you know, are we also talking about white women and the mythology that being a white woman and feminist makes you more hip, when in fact, in some ways, that makes you an intercontinental ballistic missile if you're not questioning that. And Angela Davis has a great 8-minute clip on on YouTube about bourgeoisie feminism, which is hysterical and actually right on target. So when we talk about being queer and how we are whitewashing our history in an attempt to assimilate into the very system that oppresses us and in turn passes on to us permission to internalize the oppressor and then oppress people who don't look like us. The disease of racism is a metastasization of privilege. And if we're not aware of how we as queer folks, with all of the wonderfulness of who we are being erased under the guise of you're just like me. So one of my favorite early moments of self-awareness was someone saying, wow, and you know, Natalie, you've heard this story, wow, you don't look gay. It's like, wow, you didn't look like an asshole until you opened your mouth. Look at what we're learning about each other. Part of this is evolving into the recognition that if we're not talking about this skin color giving you privilege to be the very person that you were marching against 2 weeks ago, our communities will feel. And in turn, we will lose the opportunity to feel others. Our communities are separated by class, race, gender, educationalism. And until we recognize that it's not about who you're having sex with, but it's about if we don't come together, that divide and conquer strategy is going to destroy us all. So you just sparked a lot of stuff for me. Thank you to everyone, but in particular for you, Emily. And I'm so glad you came out. I know you were struggling with that. So nice work. All right, I'm done.
Oh, no, I think the points that you're making were so, to emphasize what both Aliana and Emily sharing, just part of what gets neglected, right? So I'd like to put a question to anybody on the panel and Joe, whoever feels comfortable So there's a great article titled "Being White Means Never Having to Say You're Ethnic" by Pamela Perry. So I'd love for you to share your thoughts about the cultural concept of whiteness and how it may impact white people's appreciation of cultural identities and connections that tend to be so critically relevant and important in communities of color, in immigrant communities, in refugee communities. Any one of you, please share your thoughts. Being white means never having to say you're ethnic.
I'm going to make this short. Being white, whatever that means, allows you to create this mythology that you're not connected to the trauma of where you come from. You know, so when I talk to other Irish folks, and my family moved here 3 generations ago, my great-grandfather was Protestant in Belfast. That didn't go over really well. And he married my grandmother, who was Catholic in Sligo. That didn't go over really well. And they had to leave Ireland. And between the two of them, they left 20-some-odd siblings and family. And when they arrived in the United States, they never spoke Gaelic again. Never had contact with Ireland again. And one of the things that the United States offered them was the opportunity to erase identity. So, hey, we're just white folks. And they never realized that they only became white 10 years before arriving in the United States, because, as we've spoken, Natalie, most folks who assume they're white have only been white for under 100 years. And I think that one of the things that whiteness does is it allows you to forget your trauma, and when that gets stirred in the family, project that trauma to other folks. Baldwin talked about this when he talked about the creation of the N-word and its utilization for white people. Whatever you project onto me is not me. It's some part of you that you need to, essentially externalize. Whiteness gives you permission to not see other people as human because you're so tied up in the privilege of being white. So that's my thumbnail. I'd love to hear from other folks.
Can you guys hear me? Okay. Thank you, Joe. Yeah, as far as when I think of culture, culture is pretty much, it's rich, it's history that pretty much predates you, right? And in psych, we know that it's resiliency, it's a protective factor, and it goes with the notion of like belongingness, something that research has proven that minorities have, and it's again, it's a protective factor. But I find it particularly interesting when I date white women, or I have white patients, and they say I don't know what my culture is, or I don't have culture. And so I find that particularly concerning, because you're pretty much doing a disservice to yourself. You're doing a disservice to a legacy that was left behind, and you're not making amends with it, and just not enjoying its richness. So I think it's concerning for white people, and I think it's important for white people to do their work, to sit down with family and say, hey, where do we come from? Who are we? What are we? And that in itself is empowering. And I think that's how you can be a good ally, when you do your own work. I mentioned in the previous question that was thrown, just myself representing the colonizer and just sitting with folks of color. You have to really sit with that discomfort, because that's the only way that you'll truly be an ally and be able to enter these realms in these space and feel adequate and feel like you belong and make work happen.
Emily, Aliana, and Tanya? Ellen, any thoughts?
I think I'll wait for the next question.
Thank you. I do think what you shared, Juan, is really quite relevant and important. And Joe, what you also said, I think there is loss there, right? And I really wonder about the ability to connect and really be curious, really be interested, stimulated, and to empower the cultural diversity of others if you are so removed from your own history, right? How can you really be excited and understand, try to understand and empathize with mine if you haven't done that work yourself? And so I hope that that's something that we all think about. Okay. All right. So I'd like at this time to ask the audience to start providing us questions that you might have for the panel and for Joe in the chat box, and we will utilize those questions. So to Joe, to our panelist, we'd like for you to, at this point, start sharing with us some recommendations and concrete actions that individuals from privileged backgrounds can take in order to be authentic allies and effective social justice advocates.
Yeah, I think that I want to start. I think the reason why I shared my example and the whole crying part was because I felt devastated. When you realize that you are a perpetrator to racism or colorism, for me, that was hurtful, that I actually was doing this to a family member, to a loved one. And so I would encourage folks, and what I'm trying to say with that is that learning about racism or anti-racism requires emotional and cultural intelligence. So you're going to feel uncomfortable. You're going to feel hurt. You just hurt somebody's feelings. You perhaps discriminated. So now you have to sit with the fact that you did this. And so logic is not going to help here, because if you operate under logic, you will come across as insensitive. I have sat in many treatment team meetings where my white colleagues have been using intellectualizing as a defense and have come across invalidating. They pathologize patients, and it is just very hurtful. And I also want to make the point, as a Latina, as a person of color, it is very hurtful to on the receiving end, because not only do I sit in these meetings and have to educate my white colleagues, then I have to go home and attempt to do classwork, and I'm expected to do very well, but I'm emotionally fatigued from doing this extra work of teaching my white colleagues, and how that has triggered me, because now it's an accumulative effect of all the microaggressions I have experienced throughout my lifetime. And so this is really important for, I think, the white folks is to understand, is that you must be emotionally intelligent. You must be aware that your racism comes out in your face too. You know, facial expression, I think, is not talked about enough in our program and in any training program. It's very important, because you can perpetuate a microaggression not by your words but your actions, and it's in your face. Your discomfort, your judgment is written all over your face. And it's important to know that because of your whiteness, you don't even know that you have done this unless you have done your work. And so I would encourage folks to not only read anti-racism literature and books, but form an open process, because open process, it really is helpful. You are unpacking your own racism, and you have colleagues to sit, it's going to sit, and support you. You need the support. And I would say to the professors on this panel that reading an article and writing a reflection is very helpful. Your comments are very helpful, but it is, I think, more helpful if you ask the student, if you're noticing some reluctance or some unpacked racism in the students' writing, that you actually have them, write a comment and say, meet me after class, and let's talk about this, let's explore this, because that has been so helpful to me on a personal level. My whole program, I was at Columbia University for 2 years, and I can't tell you how many of my professors and TAs said, you have so many assumptions about this culture, you have so many, let's talk about this. And that has been transformative to who I am now.
Thank you for sharing that, Tanya. I want to sort of jump off of that a little bit. I think as allies, allyship is messy, right? So let's just put it out there. It's messy, it's uncomfortable, and we're never going to get it right. It's a continuous, lifelong journey. So none of us get to achieve this reign of allyship, right? So I want to put that out there. But I also want to say, I think that sometimes among people who are really well-intended and we're looking to be allies, there's confusion about like, okay, I don't want to sort of assume this white savior complex, right? And be leading the charge of, against racial injustice. But I'm also hearing that I shouldn't be asking my Black colleagues and friends of color to be educating me. So I wanted to sort of, it's a very fine line. And so how I've been thinking about it, and again, just from my experience, there are a lot of history books out there. I don't need my Black friends to give me a history lesson. That's on me, and I can do that. But what I do really think is important is when Black leaders, community members, people in our circle are advising us, hey, this is what we need white allyship to do, we really got to listen when that starts to happen, right? We should follow their mentorship, follow their guidance. I should not be the one out there, with my face plastered all over everywhere, being the poster child of allyship. So how can we, one, do some education on our own, but two, really follow the guidance of communities of color? And when we do find ourselves, and I got this feedback the other day from a friend, which I'm very grateful to her, I was given a space where I was able to use my privilege and my voice to talk about these things. And she said, next time, this is a friend of color, she said, next time, why don't you use your platform to elevate other voices of Black people? And that is the next step in allyship that I can be taking. If I do assume this platform, if I do have this place where I can use my privilege, what am I doing to elevate the voices of Black scholars, writers, other people in the field? So I think thinking about that line, right? We don't want to be a white savior, but we also cannot keep putting the burden on our colleagues of color to be educating us.
And I think even thinking about allyship as a habit that needs to be nurtured, and because allyship, it has to be something that you hold as a foundation of yourself, because it has to be every day, and you have to commit to that journey. Even with something as like exercise, you need to make it a habit to sit with yourself, to question like, oh, what was that, when you hear something and you're feeling a little bit of something, but you're not feeling it enough to know what to say or what's going on. But when you feel that and you ask questions about where that's coming from, you can find out a little bit more, do some little Google searches so you get that language, and you can start talking and saying things when these things happen in front of you, of like, oh, why would you say that? Like, what makes you think that was okay to say? Did you know about this? Because those conversations need to happen, like, without people of color, but also with white people, with other white people. Sorry, I lost my train of thought here. It's just like that idea of like, I just was reading William James, the psychologist, in my history systems, of like the importance of habits and seizing on every opportunity that comes to you, and making sure that it is strong within yourself with a foundation, and so that you can grow upon it and you can make this habit so strong that it takes less conscious thought the more that you build on it. And I think that is important for allyship too, so that becomes a habit. It becomes something that's unconscious almost, and that becomes easier for you to speak up against it.
I just want to say something really quick. The term like accomplice as opposed to allyship can be really powerful. So using that in terms of like looking at, it's more action focused, right? It's more, all right, I'm going to actually do something. And so, yeah, in general, like, I think that's a really good place to start of accomplice.
I think one of the things that I would like to add to this is, first of all, everyone on the panel has brought up a really important point. The concrete thing that white people can do is join together with other white people. So get involved with, you know, organizations like Showing Up for Racial Justice. And the reason I bring this up is because in my journey when I began this work, not only was it painful, it was mind-numbing, and it leads to a detoxification experience that is in fact physical. Nausea, anger, there is an acute stress reaction that comes with beginning to differentiate. You know, as a couples therapist, as a sex therapist, you know, I'm not necessarily interested in co-regulation, I'm interested in differentiation. And part of what white folks need to do is differentiate from the cultural symbiosis that constantly whispers in your ear, remain invisible. You know, the term allyship, the term accomplice, I really get sketched out around those terms for a couple of reasons, because it's easy to claim those terms without doing the work. And it's easy to say, you know, like I've heard folks on the other side say, oh, you're a social justice warrior. And I'm like, social justice warrior? Okay, so where is that a problem? So the thing that comes up is when you connect with other white people and let white folks bear witness to your story, and you're bearing witness to their story, what it does is it breaks the acute stress reaction of beginning to differentiate between I'm a bad person versus I was raised in a system that has conditioned me to be terrified of other people, internalize the aggression, and project onto them my fears. The other thing is, if you're going to do this work in terms of concrete awareness and skill building, such as joining white affinity groups, it's important that the groups you belong to are also in combination or rather in conversation with communities of color that are holding them accountable. It becomes really important to recognize that you can be out there and say, we're fighting for social justice, we're fighting for people of color. And if you show up and you're getting snarky with cops, if you're getting snarky with other folks, what you're actually doing is damaging the representation that you want to hold deeply. White people need at times to just be quiet and listen, and to be really aware that even the language we create around how we join with communities of color are often steeped in war. So ally, accomplice, all right? And they send messages that are in themselves reinforcing of the very anti-racist practice we want to begin challenging. So I think what becomes important is assistant self-reflection, and the ability to mourn and grieve what you have been taught, because it is a loss, white folks. It is a loss to begin decentering internalized racial superiority. But it also allows you to do something that folks in AA and NA have been talking about for years, to become human size. And once you become human size, you're better positioned to stand shoulder to shoulder rather than trying to stand above and enacting racism with the language of social justice.
Thank you very, very much. There's a question that comes from Megan St. Angelo that I'd like for you guys to think about. She makes the point that in many clinical placements, you are oftentimes instructed, encouraged by supervisors to avoid conversations around race, ethnicity, socio-political issues that we're dealing with clients. So her question is, how can I remain as a white clinician, authentic as a clinician, while also not violating ethical boundaries when these issues do come up, when clients bring up these issues?
I can speak to that a little bit. I did, before coming to graduate school, I did a lot of work in the Department of Correction, and the gentlemen who I worked with were primarily men of color. And there's different feelings about this. I got different opinions from different supervisors, but it became very important to me that I acknowledge my privilege every time I started working with a new client. Hey, I'm a young white woman. I understand that I have no idea what your life has been like. And so if I say something or something doesn't feel right, I want you to feel that you can call me out on it, and I vow that I'm going to do my work outside of this session to figure that out. And so creating the space and acknowledging it, I think, is helpful. But I also think wanting our clients, if our clients are people of color, wanting them to be able to talk and ask questions about their culture, and not in a way where they're having, again, to educate us, but the way that any therapist would add a question with curiosity and compassion, and to show that you see them, because we know color blindness is extremely detrimental, and so we cannot have color blindness in the therapy room. And so I think that's one concrete way, perhaps, you could invite those conversations into the session.
So we also have another question to put to you guys, coming from Heather Rhymes. As a white clinician, how can I be actively, I think this should be non-racist, while also coming from a place of training that is focused on the client's voice and choice in meeting people where they are? How do I call out bias of all kinds while trying to build rapport? This is something that Dr. Sharman Jackman has been bringing attention to recently, when we're sitting with clients who are using racial slurs, are presenting perspectives and ideas that reflect a lack of understanding of marginalized communities and a disrespect of marginalized communities. Do we, as clinicians, and particularly white clinicians, what responsibilities are out there?
I would like to help on this one for a moment. As a social worker who's been doing this, 34 years, all right. I did 6 years of street outreach with prostitutes, gang members, homeless folks, worked in psychiatric facilities, and been doing social work for a million years. I think it's really important that that gets called out. Now, this is a social work perspective. I can't speak for the students here. You are not independently licensed. You have a relationship with William James. What I would say is follow their lead. And then when you get out, start reading how to do this. So one of the things that comes up is when people bring this up and I hear them talk about, these folks or those folks or that, one of the things I'll do is I'll stop them and I'll say, I'm unsure right now where this is coming from, right? Because it's interesting to me, and I often hear this from trauma survivors or folks who grew up in environments similar to where I grew up, whether it be South, East Boston, Dorchester, so on and so forth. And one of the things that becomes important is the way I handle that as a white person might be different from how people of color handle that. So when I turn around and I'm like, listen, it's really interesting to me when I hear you talk about this and there's a trauma history, because it seems to me that what you're doing right now is projecting onto those communities the way you were treated. And I don't know if this is just part of how you view the world or if this is you saying there's pain inside of you that you can't sit with and you want someone else to carry. The other thing that I will do is, if the relationship with the person is good enough and I tend to work longer term, is I will say to folks, I'm like really curious, where in our relationship did you learn that it was okay to come in here and spill that without inviting that into clinical process? Where in the course of our work together? Now, this is a very intersubjective, very relational model that's highly informed by the clinical application of queer theory and showing up as a human being to another person. And then I will also ask, I'm really curious, one white person to another, is what you're saying what you assume I believe? And what is the space between us to really unpack that? And it becomes imperative to set a zero tolerance policy. And I know that that might sound like a really radical claim, and I don't care. But one of the things that becomes really important to talk about is we hear so much every day in the course of our work. We hear about rape, about death, about suicide, about people doing horrible things to one another. All right. We have to be prepared to file reports on people who are abusing their children or hospitalizing someone who could potentially hurt themselves or someone else. But we back away from racism. The fact that the question is asked suggests how powerful it is to just how steeped we are in being gobsmacked in the presence of that. It also speaks to the whiteness of psychotherapy. Well, we don't want to have conversations where we upset our clients. That's bullshit. If you're not upsetting the client in some way, you're not doing psychotherapy, you're fucking hand-holding. So to be able to bring into the room the importance of being able to say, racism is something that we can talk about in relationship to your pain, but it is not something you get to ejaculate on me. That's said as a sex therapist. So anyway, that's my response to that.
Wow. I think a lot of people are having some strong reactions to that, because I think, you know, what you're providing is some really, really important context. The fact that the very silence is coming from that place of maintaining white supremacy.
That's
right?
right.
The fact that we can talk about deeply, deeply intimate, personal aspects of people's lives, but we should not touch this particular issue. I think that's quite telling. Aliana, any thoughts?
Oh, now we're good? Okay. All right. It's a constant struggle. I would say so this is coming from someone who is not licensed, not a clinician, but I certainly felt that as one of several white women who work with these kiddos every day, now it's not so much in person, that we had to verbalize and bring to light the fact that, you know, we are all white women teaching children of color, and we have to be really honest about that with ourselves and with them and their families. I think being humble in that respect is super important. I will also say, in terms of my own activism, so because my role right now, it's not a super clinical, like social work focus right now. I wanted to get my experience in that in some other way. So I did start joining, like, for instance, the Democratic Socialists of America, who want to work towards defunding and abolishing police officers. And that's sort of my avenue into this conversation. So yeah, I don't have much to say beyond that, but I do know that I just have to work with my strengths and my interests and figure out what I'm doing here. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Anybody else?
Yeah, I think. Can you guys hear me?
Mhm.
Okay. Yeah. I think Joe pretty much nailed it. But for myself, when doing therapy with patients, it's not, and I think for everyone, it's not our role or our job to change people. It's our job to be there, listen to them, embrace them, and give them a lending ear. But that doesn't mean that you can't unpack these things, these conversations, and perhaps the patient is distorting, right? It's appropriate to challenge them. That's healthy. You're not inducing harm. And I think that's the way to go when having these difficult conversations. And even for myself, I work with the geriatric population, so it's interesting when I had a situation where I walked in on a patient and their family was visiting, and they're very conservative, and this conversation was being had about the border, and then I walk in, a Latino, right? So all eyes were on me. So, and this patient, right, she has her views, and that's fine. I'm not gonna change them, but I can unpack them with her, and I think that's the way to go with patients.
Anybody else?
Yeah, I wanted to share that several years ago, I was doing in-home therapy. I was working with a Mexican family, and the youth was beaten up by another Puerto Rican youth, and it was gang membership. And the family several times was reporting stereotypes and biases against Puerto Ricans, not realizing that I, in fact, was Puerto Rican. So at first I just listened, but it was a theme that was happening. Because again, I know as a clinician, this is not about me. So initially I didn't address this, but it was an ongoing theme. And what I did was I just pointed out, this is what we do as clinicians. We are observing. And I pointed out the observation that, this is surfacing for the family. How does it feel? And I asked them, how does it feel to be working with a Puerto Rican clinician? And they were stunned. They were like, I didn't know you were Puerto Rican, and we processed it. It was such a great clinical moment for both of us. And they shared that, they're surprised that they met a good Puerto Rican clinician, and so we talked about that. And so I think it's important because first off, I wasn't defensive. I wasn't internalizing what they were saying. And when I was ready and when I realized this is an ongoing theme, I was able to challenge it. And that has happened to me multiple times in different aspects, even about like, I was born and raised in Newark. I've had family say, oh, I would never go to Newark, or I would never do this, Newark this. And I said, well, I am from Newark. And how does it work? How does it feel, again, to work with a clinician who was born and raised in Newark? And it opened up great conversation, again, learning experience for both.
Thank you. We have another question from Megan. And the question really focuses in on LGBTQIA youth. And the question is, how do we help youth navigate these conversations, but also maintain safety in the home?
Just to clarify, is the conversations that we're having in the home about racism and anti-racist allyship?
Yes, we're talking about LGBTQ youth clients who are attempting to engage conservative parents around the social tensions we're experiencing. So Megan's question is, how do we help youth navigate these conversations while also maintaining safety?
I think that one of the things that comes up is that when you're working with kids, there are several different layers here that I would share, and then I would love to hear from other folks. And to keep it in line with conversations about folks of color and allyship, let's start with LGBT youth of color first. I think the thing that comes up with any LGBTQIA plus, there's so many initials, is that the first thing that we want to do is talk to them about, is it safe to come out for you now? So the first thing that you want to do is, because we know what happens to kids when they come out and they're not accepted, all right? And the research has been demonstrated in this for years. Higher rates of suicide, substance abuse, survival sex work, HIV infection, so on and so forth. So the first thing that we want to do with LGBT youth who are in the process of exploring identity is to ask, is it safe to do so with family now? If not, who do you have as an adult who's either queer or straight, who is there to assist you in being a sounding board while also giving you a lot of reality testing? That's one thing. The second thing is, it becomes really important to recognize that youth, by definition alone, are neurologically not mature enough to think long-term because everything is in the moment. Having those conversations is important. The other part is there an aunt, grandmother, grandfather, someone in the family who can hold stuff? If it's safe to move forward and the parents already are familiar with family members, then you can facilitate the conversation. And I really recommend that for folks who want to do that, in addition to allyship, and Natalie, we've talked about this before, you have solid training in how to work systemically. You cannot apply a psychodynamic model to a family system model. So, and when I'm talking family systems, I'm talking structural, strategic, Winnian, postmodern, something you can draw from where you can begin charting what's happening in the family as this information is being disclosed, and watching how structures are changing right in front of your face. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, in talking with conservative parents, it becomes important for these kids who are often, not always, leaning left in homes where folks might be leaning right, to talk about how do you introduce one topic at a time, just like in couples therapy, one topic at a time. Because if you go in armed for beer, it's important to know that your parents have an arsenal of nuclear weapons and you have a pea shooter. And are you looking to change your parents, or are you looking to engage in dialogue about how the family believes? Most of the times with kids, there's a sense of righteous indignation, and they want to move forward and change the whole system. This is where, if you have any community organizing skills, it becomes important to say you are not going to change your family overnight. 1 to 2 issues tops per month. And as your family gets comfortable with those issues, you will soon build a repertoire. That's what I would say about how to work with LGBT youth and parents and right-leaning parents.
Thank you so very much. This has been an enriching conversation. We appreciate you, Joe, for being here with us, and to our amazing, courageous, empathic students. We are so incredibly grateful. So we're going to start wrapping up. It's gone by really quickly. What a intensely interesting and stimulating conversation. And we can see from the comments in the chat that people have enjoyed it and felt that they've learned a lot here today. So thank you all. Ellen, I'm going to turn it over to Ellen, who's going to lead us in a meditation. So if everybody can just stay with us for our meditation and our ending remarks. Thank you. Ellen?
Please join us in the loving kindness meditation. Please close your eyes. Think of a person close to you who loves you. Imagine that person standing on your right side, sending their love and wishes for your safety and happiness. Feel warm wishes and love coming towards you. Now bring to mind someone who cherishes you deeply. Imagine that person on your left side, sending you wishes for your health and happiness. Feel kindness coming to you from that person. Now imagine that you are surrounded by all who love or loved you. They are sending wishes for your happiness and well-being. Bring awareness back to the Zoom box on your right side. Send the love that you feel back to that person. You and this person are similar. Just like you, this person wishes to be happy. Please repeat the following phrase silently. May you live with ease. May you be happy. May you be free from pain. May you live with ease. May you be happy. May you be free from pain. Now focus your awareness on the person on your left Zoom box. Send your love to that person. That person, like you, wishes to have a good life. Repeat with me silently. Just as I wish to. May you be safe. May you be healthy. May you live with ease and happiness. Just as I wish to. May you be safe. May you be healthy. May you live with ease and happiness. Now picture the whole globe in front of you as a little ball. Send warm wishes to living beings on the globe who, like you, want to be happy. Repeat with me, just as I wish to. May you live with ease, happiness, and good health. Take a deep breath in and breathe out. When you're ready, you may open your eyes. Thank you.
Thank you, Ellen. We appreciate that. The work that we do, many of us here are clinicians of some kind, providing support to many, and it can be incredibly draining. And we're in a time that really is testing all of us in so many different ways and requires that we engage in deliberate empathy, that we are thoughtful about the ways we are supporting each other, the ways we're listening to each other, the ways we're holding each other, nurturing each other, and empowering each other. I want to make the point as we wrap up that it's quite easy to get into a space of despair. Joe spoke to this because what we're dealing with is so enmeshed. We're talking about centuries of pain, centuries of loss, centuries of degradation, centuries in which wealth and power and influence is manifested in the lives of many, while devastation and challenge and resilience has manifested in the lives of others. So it's easy when we think about how complex these issues are to start to get overwhelmed, to start to feel powerless, to start to feel as though you as one individual will not have the capacity to change these systems that we're all impacted by. I really hope that from our lovely, amazing, thoughtful, courageous panelists and our incredible Joseph Winn, who has really led a fabulous conversation today, I hope that you hear from us the necessity of maintaining a sustained focus, an authentic focus on these issues. We can definitely say that things will not change if we don't engage in that change ourselves. So please do not allow and permit yourself the luxury of giving up, giving in to despair and powerlessness and feeling overwhelmed. I come from a people who didn't have that luxury, and it is my expectation that our white allies who for generations been privileged with the luxury of not attending to the issues that are being brought up, that you do your work, shore yourself up, develop the necessary resilience to stay in a sustained fight against white supremacy. So I hope that we all, in our own individual lives, in our individual spaces, continue to impact those that are in those spaces. I hope that we all recognize the power that we have to really shift what has for too long been the status quo. So let's keep having this conversation. Thank you so much for joining us today. We deeply appreciate you. The Center for Multicultural and Global Mental Health at William James College will continue to find ways to support and educate and have these conversations. So keep your eye out. Thank you so much to Emily, to Juan, to Tanya, to Ellen, to Aliana, and Joe, my dear friend. I so appreciate and love you. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you, Dr. Court, for having me as a panelist.
Our pleasure.
Thank you, everyone on the panel.
Thank you.
What an honor to get to hang out with you. I can't wait to watch your careers bloom and hopefully consult with you someday.
Feel
now,
free.
Are we hanging around to debrief, or are we...
Sure. Just I wanted to make sure that Emily, Juan, Ellen, and Aliana, Tanya, if you guys had any last remarks before we wrap up.
Yes, I want to quickly say that please apologize if you have indeed, were a perpetrator of racial microaggressions, and just work through it. The person in the receiving end will be grateful, and that's the healing. That's where the healing begins. When you're accountable, and the person receiving it can really heal through this accountability.
Excellent.
Yes, I would also like to say, for the first step of people who are really passionate about allyship and fighting against racial injustice, the first thing we do is lean into the uncomfortable. We explore ourselves. What ways am I perpetuating racism? What ways am I benefiting from it? Really look at ourselves, have those hard conversations with our white peers. That's the first step. And I would also thank Dr. Court so much for moderating this discussion, and Dr. St. Louis, who's been behind the scenes doing everything. So thank you, Dr. St. Louis, as well.
Juan, Ellen, any last remarks? Aliana?
Real quick, again, I'm a fan of real quick sentences. I would say the reminder of, yes, there's no microwave solution to this is very humbling. And whenever I'm feeling exhausted, I'm like, this is nothing, honestly. So I don't know what I'm fretting about. But yes, self-care is still important.
Thank you. I would say for everyone to get involved as much as you can. If your pockets are available, donate to organizations. That's the way that research gets done and movements continue. And just have a big heart. Love people. Love everyone. Love yourself.
I was going to say be kind to yourself through this process. Be kind to others that are there and who you are witnessing their journey. And take care of yourself. And we all came into this field because we have big hearts. And I think that will help us through this journey.
Absolutely. And as Emily shouted out, let's give a shout out to Dr. Jemima St. Louis, who is one of our directors and just an amazing role model. Dr. Jill Bloom, co-director of the Multicultural Center, is ride or die. She's that ride or die chick.
Yes.
Dr. Mari Benassar, who has led our Latino mental health program so ably, so successfully, so powerfully that it's given birth to other programs. I also want to give shout out to Dr. Catherine Vuki, who just started our Asian mental health concentration, the only one existing in the country. So we are surrounded by amazingly committed colleagues. And we thank you, especially to our students, the students in all of our concentrations in the academy, at WJC, who all the time, every single day, you guys inspire us to be better. We thank you and we appreciate you.